Hi, here we are with our next part of Evidence Not Seen. I thought of the many nights spent in the trench, looking up at the night sky. I reveled in the magnificent display in the heavens, the sun, the moon, the planets, and I wondered how such a one, the great creator, could have a personal interest in me, a young woman without any special gifts, talents, or beauty. Sometimes the very magnitude of his handiwork made him seem almost remote. But that night, that one, the high and lifted up Holy One of God, wearing his most magnificent robe, a robe of human flesh, came to dwell with a child of man in a new and beautiful relationship. Oh, the wonder of his love for me and his personal concern for me as an individual was overwhelming. Together we walked through the events of that day. I heard again the insistence of his voice as he reminded me of Mrs. Lye's Bible, not my bride's book, nor my full 5-year diary. It had to be Mrs. Lye's Bible that was lying on my bed directly above the ladder. Then it came clear to me why he didn't remind me of either of the two books, neither of which could ever be replaced. I would have been up there, tearing at the mat, trying to retrieve them, and without doubt the burning building would have collapsed on me. I just escaped as it was. Oh Lord, you saved my life. Thank you for reminding me of this Bible. I hugged it to me, for Mrs. Lye had said I should keep it. I had much to be thankful for. Of all the Japanese I have ever had any contact with, none terrified me like the brain. I poured out my gratitude to God that the brain hadn't noticed me when I passed through the gate. I thanked God for the miracle that none of us were killed or hurt during the machine gun strafing. I knelt again before my bride's book lying open on the heap of ashes. I saw how bright and shining the gold ink had become. The gold had to pass through the fire to destroy the tarnish, and it was the background of a black charred page that displayed its beauty. A beauty I had never noticed, written as it had been on a bright white page surrounded by pretty flowers. I understand, Lord, I really do understand what you're saying to me through this. Forgive my tears. I learned that my tears were a gift from him to ease the hurt, a gift to be shared with others who were hurting. Was I not to weep with those who weep? Romans 12:15. While the tarnish begins to appear, take me through the fire, Lord. I am available. One by one, he pulled scripture passages out of the storehouse of my memory to remind me that they had been hidden there for such a time as this. I have chosen thee in the furnace of affliction. Isaiah 48:10. This verse calls to remembrance my Lord in a blazing furnace with 3 young Hebrew men. There was something so poignant, so intimate about the privilege that was theirs of walking around in the fire with their Lord. Because of their testimony, the faith, and the courage of these 3 young men, the king and a crowd of people caught a glimpse of Jesus. When they emerged from the furnace, there was no acrid, caustic scent of fire upon them, just the fragrance that emanated from 3 young people who had been walking with their Lord in the furnace of affliction. That's very important, isn't it, Lord? I pray that if I come out of this war alive, I may be sweet-smelling, not bitter or cynical, but like a sweet-smelling, fragrant incense unto you. All this long day you have walked with me, and never for a moment have I been out of your sight. Of this you have made me keenly aware. I saw again in my mind's eye the bomb canister there in the ditch among the ashes of a mattress, and I knew how much my Lord loved me. Singing what had come to be my Lord's lullaby for me, I fell asleep. Loved with everlasting love, led by grace that loved to know, Spirit breathing from above, thou hast taught me it is so. Oh, this full and perfect peace, oh, this transport all divine, in a love which cannot cease, I am his and he is mine. At first light the next morning, Ruth found herself in full possession of our mutual piece of blanket. "Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I didn't realize how narrow it was," she apologized. "That's all right, Ruth. You flounced sooner and stronger than I did, and I didn't have the heart to wake you up." It was good to be able to laugh. From then on we fell asleep back to back, with the piece of blanket covering our topsides. Whoever flounced first usually stayed in possession of it till morning. Blankets weren't the only thing in short supply. With an average of 1 comb to 9 people and head lice on the increase, Ruth and I decided that the wisest course was to cut our hair off short. Ruth had her scissors, so she cut mine and I cut hers. Most of the women were detailed to work in the garden and the old camp kitchen. The chickens and pigs had been incinerated by the fire. We dared not eat the pigs because of the gasoline jelly. Otherwise, that would have been quite a barbecue. The planes returned 3 days later to bomb the old camp with shrapnel bombs in an attempt to destroy all the stone houses and the Japanese headquarters. We hid during the bombing among the trees near our hut. As it was growing dark the following evening, Sweet 17 came to say that Commander Yamaji wanted me to come. I ran across the rice field to the old camp, arriving in time to see a car pulling away from the headquarters. Word had come from Makassar to say that Freddie had passed away and would be brought in the following day. They had excised the leg completely, but the gasoline jelly had eaten into the intestines, so it was impossible for them to save him. I want you to tell Nanja Paul you have received similar news, and you know how to help her as you have been helped. The teacher is still in the hospital. They took her leg off above the knee in order to save the thigh, but they couldn't save Sinjo. Master, will you tell her? I assured him I would, though I had never done anything like this before, and I will pray with her and the sister, for it is God alone who can help a person in a time like this. It will be very difficult for Nanja Paul. Freddie was her only son. I understand, but you will know how to help her. He will be brought in tomorrow, then you can tell her. He bowed to me and said, "Good night. Thank you, Nanja." I returned his bow and left, wondering what I would say when they asked me what the commander had wanted. Freddie was the apple of Sarah's eye. What could I say to help ease the pain? How sad, sad for all the family. It was a fairly long walk across the rice field to our jungle camp. When I arrived at the hut, everyone was sleeping, so I felt it best not to waken them for devotions. I found my place near the door next to Ruth, but I couldn't sleep for thinking of Sarah and Dolly's anguish. Suddenly, the sound of the air raid alarm and the distant hum of approaching aircraft startled everyone into wakefulness. Pandemonium broke out, children and mothers crying out, trying to find one another in the dark. A traffic jam occurred as they all tried to exit simultaneously through the small one and only door. I checked to make sure everyone was out of the hut, then groped my way with others from tree to tree, seeking a place to shelter away from the bamboo buildings. The Stygian darkness enhanced the awful fear that made our pulses race and our throats feel dry. We knew that the planes would soon be directly overhead. Was our new camp the target? What kind of bombs would they use? Facing death again, we committed ourselves into his care. None was ashamed to pray for mercy. With bated breath, we waited to hear the whistling of the bombs. Then, miracle of miracles, the planes passed us by. Or were they checking the location of the jungle camp? No, they continued on toward the west. Just as fervently as we had prayed for mercy, expressions of thankfulness were voiced unashamedly to God. The raid took place on a Japanese airfield and encampment not far from us. No one moved until the planes could no longer be heard and the all clear was sounded. Then we made our way back to the hut. As I took roll call to make sure no one was missing, discussion began at the other end of the hut. Finally, one of the women called out, "Darlene Deibler, we need to talk to you." Every night during devotions you prayed that God wouldn't allow the planes to come, especially for the sake of our children, and it's so difficult to find a place of shelter during the dark of the moon. and the planes have not come. But tonight, you weren't here for the devotions. The planes came. If you're called to the headquarters again, we want you to know we don't care what time it is. When you return, please waken us so that you can pray with us that the planes will not come. I never had to waken them. They were always waiting for me. Never again did we have a night raid, or even the sound of approaching planes to disturb our sleep. I missed Sarah while collecting porridge the following morning. As soon as I had finished sorting out work details, I went in search of her. I met her returning from the vegetable garden and fell in beside her, slowing my pace to allow others of the garden detail to get ahead of us. When I placed my hand on her arm and stopped, I saw the color drain from her face. Oh, God. Her heart was crying. Give me the right words to say. I saw the color drain from her face. Oh, God, my heart was crying. Give me the right words to say. Then, as gently as I knew how, I told her about Freddie. She reached for my hands, and neither of us could restrain our tears. Sarah, I'm so very sorry for you and Dolly. I'm sorry for all of us. Freddie will be missed. I do understand your grief. Believe me, I do. I held her, and we prayed with a quietness of peace. An acceptance of his will gave us the strength to go back to the shack. At her request, I told Dolly and the others about Freddie's death. Lovingly and quietly, the people surrounded Sarah and Dolly to share their sorrow. It was very hard for the young people to accept that Freddie was gone. They had been a close-knit group, and unashamedly, they cried for the death of their friend. We went as a group to headquarters to wait for the ambulance that was to bring Freddie back. I suggested to Sarah that I be allowed to keep the wake that night, as she and Dolly would need their rest. She agreed, knowing that Dolly wouldn't go back to the hut alone. When the ambulance arrived, Freddie was carried into the commander's office and laid on a bamboo bed, made ready by Mr. Yamaji. Sarah and Dolly went inside while we, who had accompanied them, waited outside. Finally, Sarah came to the door to nod that it was all right for us to come in. Silently, we mourned with them. The lower part of Freddie's body was covered with a sheet. He looked very peaceful, and I was grateful that his face didn't show how very much he must have suffered. With an embrace or a word of sympathy to Sarah and Dolly, the various ones took their leave. I whispered to Sarah that I would be back to relieve her and Dolly as soon as devotions were finished. She nodded, and I left, knowing that those closest to her and Dolly wouldn't leave until I returned. Once I was alone with Freddie for my vigil, I set a chair near the head of the bed. A small oil lamp had been left burning. It was a night for thinking and listening. I had never been alone and this close before to a person who had passed away. I turned the chair so that I could look at Freddie's face. Then the words of a very wise man came to me, and the voice of memory spoke. There is a time to be born and a time to die. Ecclesiastes 3:2. Both are times accompanied by pain. The pain of giving birth, mingled with the exquisite joy that a child has been born, and the pain of death, mingled with the bitter dregs of sorrow that a child has died. Sarah's joy and pride in her son had turned to a pain and a great sense of loss. I thought about Freddie as he had been, a tall, handsome young man of fine physique, accepting a happy life when the war is over. I wondered if he had lived, could he have coped with the loss of his limb, or might the loss have left him bitter and psychologically as well as physically crippled? God only knows, and in his infinite wisdom he had taken Freddie, who was so young, while many who had lived well and long were still among us. I only know that my Lord makes no mistakes. I wept in my own aloneness, remembering another day and another year when I had lifted the cup of sorrow to my lips and drunk my portion of the bitter dregs. But in the dark hours of that night he came to me, the author of life, to remind me of his words, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. John 11:25. Once more, peace and comfort, like a mighty river, flooded my soul. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? 1 Corinthians 15:55. I prayed for Freddie's father in Peri Peri, wondering if it would be months before he learned of his only son's death. I thought also of other bereaved families whose husbands, fathers, and brothers had yet to learn of their losses. When the first streaks of dawn lightened the sky, I looked up to see Mr. Yamaji standing in the doorway. "Nanja, you go. I will watch." I nodded and left, praying that God would bring to his remembrance our discussion of 2 years ago concerning death, sorrow, hope, and life everlasting. Few of us will forget the memorial service held in the open field in the northeast corner of the old camp. It was appropriately conducted by the Catholic priest and the Protestant dominie. The commander and the second-in-command attended in full-dress uniform. The service over, we filed silently beside the coffins draped in white cloth. The victims of the bombing were buried alongside our earlier dead. The line of simple mounds lengthened, the starkness of bare earth soon to be softened in green. A strange stillness pervaded our jungle camp. It was like a breathless waiting, but for what? We didn't know. We remembered the bombing raids of the previous year, the months of miserable nights spent in the rain in the muddy slit trenches. After months of air raids, they had ceased, so we had relaxed and dared to entertain the hope that peace talks were in progress and the end of our imprisonment was imminent. Then a year later, we found ourselves in the midst of a repeat performance. Months of days and night bombings around our camp, nights in the trenches, shivering in the rain, but there the similarity ceased. Our camp, a camp of women and children, had become the target for bombing raids, not just once, but twice targeted for total destruction. Why? Was it to destroy a workforce used by the Japanese, or were we just expendable? We buried our dead and were then set to the onerous task of stacking up the canisters from the incendiary bombs and cleaning up the old campsite. The stinking mud of the gardens aggravated our tropical ulcers. Our eyes searched the sky for approaching planes. We noted the nearest trenches as we moved about the camp to know where to run in case of another bombing raid. The doctors and nursing staff, with those of the sick who were not ambulatory, were re-established in the damaged hospital. It was near the commander's bomb shelter. The planes were no longer coming over the camp, but there was daily activity to the north of it. We wondered if Peri Peri was being bombed. We were greatly concerned for the men, and nightly our prayers encompassed them with petitions for their safety. We wondered if our camp was to be relocated, or would we be left in the dreadful jungle camp. A terrible apathy settled upon us. Animated speculation about after the war or when I'm free was no longer heard. Even the children were listless. We had no illusions of being left ladies of leisure. However, contemplation about the future was debilitating. To make morale worse, the grass roof was leaking, so restless nights followed rainy days. Most of us had no change of clothing. We worked in our one set of clothes. We bathed in them in the rain without soap, and drip-dried or not, we slept in them. Lord, we need some kind of diversion. We're becoming a tribe of zombies. The diversion came. It came in the form of a very large monitor lizard. The young people saw it one morning and were trying to corner it under our shack. They had armed themselves with clubs and were yelling to us women inside, "Can't you see him?" Oh yes, we had no trouble seeing through the slatted floor the drama that was taking place under us. The lizard had lifted himself high on his legs. His mouth was open and his tongue was darting back and forth as he hissed, showing very sharp teeth. He was looking to see if he could break through the floor. When the clubs were thrown at him from one side, he raced to the other end of the building, trying to escape. We fled to the opposite end of the hut to escape the teeth tearing at the bamboo and rattan. The lizard would follow us and we'd scream, "He's here, he's here," as we jumped up and down, trying to keep our feet from being bitten. Clubs were flying from all sides. The children were yelling as they wriggled under the shed to retrieve their clubs. We women screamed and yelled and laughed while running from one end of the shed to the other in a pack. thinking what a marvelous addition he would make to our rice and vegetables. Lizard tail is very good eating. At that time, what wouldn't be very good eating? But alas, while the children shifted, retrieving their clubs, the lizard made good his escape from under the house and headed for the jungle with amazing speed. We darted outside and grabbed up clubs to join the chase. Racing through the trees, sidestepping some of the large ferns and dodging the hanging vines, we followed on, yelling encouragement to those in front of us. The children finally gave up, admitting defeat. We drifted back to the shack and threw ourselves on the floor, winded but still laughing, as each related his or her part in the battle with the monster. Growing quiet, we sat up, looking at one another and smiled. How good the excitement, the yelling, the laughter, the releasing of pent-up emotions had been. For half an hour or so we had become savages, intent on food, exhilarated by the chase, enabled for a moment of time to forget the horrors we had experienced during the past weeks and the familiar drudgery of today and tomorrow. Soon the commander brought in native laborers to begin construction of a new schoolhouse on the old campsite. One early afternoon, Corporal Voskuil came to say that all barracks leaders were asked to assemble in the partially completed building. Mr. Yamaji had an announcement to make. Entering the building, we found Mrs. Joustra standing in front of Mr. Yamaji. When he said, Nanja Joustra is no longer head of the camp, Nanja Deibler is now the head. A shockwave went through the building that left us speechless. I couldn't believe what I had heard, nor could the others. I stood dumbfounded. Recovering, I gasped, "Oh no, Tuan, I couldn't take Nanja Joustra's place. I don't know enough about running a camp like this." Before he could reply, one of the other barracks leaders broke in, complaining that I was much too young, and one of them should be chosen. I felt grateful for her protestations. I certainly didn't want the position. Mr. Yamaji was angry at the uproar. His cane came down on one of the desks with a terrible crash, and there was an instant silence. "Enough! Do you understand? I have said that Nanja Deibler is the new head of the camp." Turning on his heel, he left. I just remembered that there was a time last night that I couldn't sleep, and over in my head, I kept hearing Mevral Deibler. Mevral Deibler. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right. I kept thinking that in the middle of the night. Mr. Yamaji, turning on his heel, he left. When he was out of earshot, I felt as if I were surrounded by a pack of jackals. "How could you? You're only a girl. We're older and more experienced. Please, listen to me. I didn't know anything about this. I did not ask for the job. I do not want to take Mrs. Joustra's place, and I'm going to tell Mr. Yamaji so." Now, I couldn't help but notice that none of them was protesting that Mrs. Joustra shouldn't be replaced. I couldn't help but notice that none of them was protesting that Mrs. Joustra shouldn't be replaced. I saw Mrs. Joustra leaving the building, so I ran up to catch up with her. "Mrs. Joustra, I'm so sorry. You're such a good camp leader. I could never fill your place." "Yes, Mevral Deibler, you can. You have been a good Leidster barracks leader, and I've talked with the commander about this. I asked to be relieved. Mevral Deibler, I'm so tired. I'll give you all the help I can, but you can do it. Mr. Yamaji has great respect for you and holds you in high regard. He said that you are trustworthy. If you said yes, you meant yes. If you said no, you meant no. You can count on my support." She looked so weary as she shook my hand that I could say no more. Hurrying back to the jungle camp, I prayed for wisdom. I wanted to tell Ruth, Lillian, and Margaret what had happened. I needed their advice. I found Ruth sitting in the doorway in the sun. "Ruth, listen. Mr. Yamaji has just announced that he made me head of the camp." Before I could tell her what had happened, she said, "I've been expecting that." "Ruth, you're no help. Why would you say that?" "Because he respects you." "But Ruth, some of the other barracks leaders are angry." They don't seem to understand that I had nothing to do with Mr. Yamaji's decision, nor did I know anything about it. I really don't want the job. Some of the others who had gathered said that Ruth was right. Didn't I know that after the Campantai had taken Margaret, Philomena, and me away, the commander would angrily jump on his bicycle and go out the back way to a village whenever the Campantai car was seen approaching. He wouldn't return until he was sure they had left. No, I didn't know that. Another lady who worked around the office told us that when the Campantai left a note for Mr. Yamaji stating that Nanja Deibler was dying of tuberculosis and would never be returned to the camp, Mr. Yamaji left for Makassar at once. He spent 3 days going from office to office before he finally received permission to enter the prison and see me. The women, not only from my barracks, but from other barracks in the Ambon camp as well, continued to gather and to encourage me to accept the position. I still had reservations in my own mind. Brace yourself. The opposition approaches, someone said. It was indeed the leader of the ones who had verbally attacked me in the classroom. As the crowd continued to gather, Mrs. Hayden, red-faced, hair in stringy disarray, proceeded to tell the gathering how unsuited I was for the position. I was much too young. Furthermore, this is a Dutch camp, and we will not have an American to rule over us. The 8 Dutch families of my barracks were ready to cross words with her. They were in my barracks at their own request, and we appreciated them. The ridiculous side of the whole fiasco struck me as being very funny, and it took some restraint not to call out to her as she flung herself around and stomped off. You'd better be careful, Mevrouw, or your sheaves will be bowing down to my sheaf. One of the women pointed out what was all too apparent. It wasn't that I was too young or that I was an American. Mrs. Hayden was jealous and wanted the position. I'm going to stop there, and we will take it up on Monday and see what happens with this whole thing. Let's say our bedtime prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Guide me gently through the night and wake me with the morning light. Amen. And we will see you on Monday. Have a good weekend.